We're told Waterloo changed Europe forever. But what if Europe had already changed decades earlier on a muddy hill at Valmy? In this video, we're resolving one big historical mystery: which battle truly shaped the modern world, the famous defeat everyone remembers, or the forgotten stand that made everything else possible? History loves grand finales, cannons roaring, empires collapsing, legends falling. That's why we remember Waterloo. But history often forgets quiet beginnings, battles where almost nothing happened, yet everything changed. That's Valmy. Tonight, we're not just comparing two battles, we're questioning how history decides what matters. Was Europe shaped by Napoleon's final defeat? Or by a battle where victory was more psychological than physical? Imagine two moments in history. One begins almost quietly, wrapped in fog, uncertainty, and doubt. The other explodes onto the world stage with thunder, chaos, and finality. These two moments are Valmy and Waterloo, and understanding their difference is the key to understanding how history truly works. Valmy was never meant to be a spectacle. In 1792, Europe expected the French Revolution to collapse under pressure, like a reckless experiment that had gone too far. Monarchies watched closely, convinced that a single strong push would restore order. What they didn't expect was a revolutionary army poorly trained, inexperienced, and made up largely of ordinary citizens standing its ground. At Valmy, there was no dramatic charge, no heroic cavalry sweep, no rivers of blood soaking the earth. Instead, there was hesitation, there was uncertainty, and then there was retreat. That retreat transformed Valmy into something far greater than a tactical encounter. It became a symbol, a signal that the old rules of power were cracking. The true power of Valmy was not in what was destroyed, but in what survived. The French Revolution lived on because of it. The idea that people, not kings, could defend a nation proved itself in the eyes of Europe. Soldiers fought not for dynasties, but for a cause they believed in. That single realization sent shockwaves far beyond the battlefield. Valmy announced the arrival of ideological warfare, where belief could stand toe-to-toe with professional armies. This was a beginning, not an ending. A quiet spark that would ignite decades of conflict and transformation. Now contrast that with Waterloo. Waterloo was the opposite of subtle. By 1815, Europe had already endured years of revolutionary and Napoleonic wars. Nations were exhausted, borders scarred, and populations weary of constant upheaval. Waterloo was not about proving an idea, it was about stopping one. Napoleon's final stand was watched by an entire continent holding its breath. Kings, generals, and politicians knew this battle would decide whether Europe would continue down a revolutionary path or slam the door shut on it forever. Waterloo did not symbolize possibility. It symbolized closure. When Napoleon fell, an era ended with him. The cannons of Waterloo did not announce a new world. They confirmed that. The revolutionary storm had finally burned itself out. Monarchies returned, diplomacy replaced mass mobilization, and Europe sought stability over transformation. Waterloo mattered because it finalized what decades of war had already set in motion. It was history drawing a line and saying no further. This is why comparing Valmy and Waterloo is not about which battle was bigger or bloodier. It is about understanding their roles in the timeline of change. Valmy opened the door to a new kind of Europe, one driven by ideas, nationalism, and mass participation. Waterloo closed that door, at least temporarily, by restoring the old balance of power. One battle whispered a dangerous possibility into the future. The other shouted that the experiment was over. To understand why Valmy and Waterloo feel so different, you have to look beyond uniforms, formations, and battle lines, and instead ask a deeper question: what exactly were these soldiers fighting for? Because at Valmy, the real weapon was not the musket or the cannon, it was an idea. And at Waterloo, the real force was not belief, but organization, discipline, and sheer military experience. In 1792, the French army that gathered near Valmy barely resembled the professional forces of Europe. Many of its soldiers were farmers, laborers, and city workers who had never marched in formation before the revolution. Officers had fled or been executed, training was inconsistent, and supplies were often unreliable. By traditional military standards, this army should not have survived a confrontation with the seasoned Prussian forces advancing toward Paris. Yet something extraordinary held them together. These men were not defending a king or obeying a noble commander. They were defending an idea that had just begun to reshape their lives, the belief that sovereignty belonged to the people. That belief changed everything. When the cannons began to fire at Valmy, the French soldiers did not scatter as Europe expected. They stood. They shouted revolutionary slogans. They sang. The battlefield became less about maneuver and more about morale. The Prussians were facing an army that refused to behave like an army was supposed to. These soldiers did not fight because they were ordered to, they fought because they believed retreat meant the death of the revolution itself. Valmy proved something no military academy could teach. An army fueled by ideas could resist one that relied purely on tradition and training. Now shift forward to Waterloo, and the atmosphere is entirely different. By 1815, Europe had learned hard lessons from years of war. Armies were no longer experiments fueled by ideology. They were machines refined by experience. The soldiers at Waterloo were professionals, drilled endlessly, commanded by officers who understood logistics, timing, and coordination at a brutal level. Even Napoleon's opponents had adapted many of his own innovations. This was not a clash of beliefs, it was a clash of systems. Napoleon himself represented a strange bridge between these two worlds. He rose because of revolutionary ideas, but by Waterloo, he commanded an empire held together by force, hierarchy, and control. His soldiers fought for loyalty, pay, and survival, not for the revolutionary dream that once electrified France. At Waterloo, morale mattered, but it was discipline and coordination that decided the outcome. When lines broke, they did not break. Because belief vanished, but because formations collapsed and reinforcements failed to arrive in time. What makes this contrast so powerful is that Valmy and Waterloo reveal two different phases of modern warfare. Valmy belongs to the moment when ideas were raw and dangerous, when belief itself could substitute for training. Waterloo belongs to a world where those ideas had been absorbed, institutionalized, and ultimately neutralized by professional armies. The passion that once terrified monarchies had become manageable, predictable, and containable. Valmy scared Europe because it suggested that ordinary people, armed with conviction, could challenge the established order. Waterloo reassured Europe because it demonstrated that even revolutionary forces could be defeated by coordination, alliances, and disciplined resistance. One battle asked whether ideas could defeat armies. The other answered that armies, once adapted, could defeat ideas. This is why Valmy feels like a rupture in history, while Waterloo feels like a conclusion. At Valmy, belief was stronger than structure. At Waterloo, structure overwhelmed belief. Together, they tell the story of how revolutionary passion ignited a continent, and how that same continent learned to contain it through organized power. When people imagine a battle that changed history, they usually picture chaos, carnage, and landscapes soaked in blood. Valmy challenges that image in a way few events ever have. This was a battle where destruction was limited, casualties were relatively low, and yet the consequences were enormous. To many observers at the time, Valmy barely looked like a battle at all, and that is exactly why it mattered. On the morning of September 20th, 1792, the air around Valmy was thick with fog and rain. Cannons thundered across the hills, but there was no decisive charge, no dramatic collapse of enemy lines. The French and Prussian armies exchanged artillery fire for hours, watching each other through smoke and uncertainty. Commanders hesitated, soldiers waited. The clash that Europe expected, a crushing blow that would end the French Revolution, never came. Instead, the Prussian army withdrew, not because it had been destroyed, but because it had lost confidence in what victory would even mean. This withdrawal baffled Europe. How could a revolutionary army, so recently formed and so poorly equipped, survive a confrontation with one of the most respected military forces of the age? The answer lies not in the physical damage inflicted, but in the psychological impact of what did not happen. The French army did not panic. It did not dissolve. It stood its ground. That single fact reshaped the strategic reality of the war. Valmy proved that the revolution could defend itself, and that proof mattered more than any pile of captured territory or fallen soldiers. In traditional warfare, victory was measured in batas, banners, and land. Valmy introduced a new metric, legitimacy. The French Revolution gained credibility overnight. Inside France, confidence surged. If citizen soldiers could stop Europe's monarchies, then the revolution was not just an idea, it was a viable state. Outside France, fear replaced certainty. Monarchs realized that crushing the revolution would not be quick, clean, or guaranteed. Limited, indecisive engagement had achieved what a decisive massacre might not have accomplished so efficiently. Now contrast this with Waterloo, a battle that fits perfectly into the classic image of destruction-driven history. Waterloo was brutal, relentless, and unforgiving. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded in a single day. Entire units were erased. Fields were transformed into graveyards. And when it ended, there was no ambiguity about the result. Napoleon was defeated, his army was broken. His political future was finished. Waterloo achieved its historical impact through overwhelming destruction. Yet this is where the contrast becomes unsettling. Waterloo needed devastation to finalize an outcome that history had already been moving toward. Valmy, by comparison, needed almost none. The power of Valmy lay in restraint, hesitation, and perception. The Prussians did not lose because they were annihilated. They lost because they recognized a problem they could not solve with force alone. They saw that the Revolutionary Army's very existence undermined the assumptions on which European warfare was built. Valmy shows that history does not always turn on slaughter. Sometimes it turns on confidence. Sometimes it turns on the moment when one side realizes that victory will cost more than it is worth. By surviving, by standing firm, and by refusing to collapse, the French army transformed a non-decisive engagement into a decisive moment. It was a battle won in the minds of commanders and politicians rather than on the field itself. This is why Valmy remains so difficult to categorize. It lacks the drama that usually defines historical turning points. There's no single heroic charge to celebrate, no catastrophic defeat to mourn. And yet its consequences echoed for decades. The French Republic was declared almost immediately after. Revolutionary wars expanded across Europe. Entire political systems were forced to adapt to a new reality born not from destruction, but from endurance. Valmy reminds us that sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones where almost nothing seems to happen, where survival itself becomes the triumph, and where the absence of collapse sends a message louder than any cannon blast. To grasp the deeper meaning of Valmy and Waterloo, you have to look at what was truly at stake in each battle. Valmy was not about a single leader, a personal legacy, or even a clear military objective. It was about survival. If Valmy had been lost, the French Revolution itself might have collapsed before it ever had the chance to reshape the world. Waterloo, on the other hand, revolved around one figure, one destiny, and one final gamble. Where Valmy saved a movement, Waterloo ended a man. In 1792, the French Revolution stood on the edge of extinction. Internally, France was divided, unstable, and unsure of its own future. Externally, Europe's monarchies were closing in, determined to crush what they saw as a dangerous infection. Valmy represented the moment when that pressure peaked. The revolutionary government did not need a sweeping victory. It needed proof that it could endure. A defeat would have validated every fear, every doubt, and every prediction that the revolution was unsustainable. A collapse at Valmy could have restored the monarchy or plunged France into chaos before revolutionary ideals had time to take root. When the French army held its ground, it gave the revolution something priceless: time to organize, time to legitimize itself, time to transform from a fragile uprising into a functioning state. Valmy did not merely protect Paris from invasion. It protected the idea that political power could be redefined. The battle ensured that the revolution would not be remembered as a failed experiment, but as a force capable of defending itself against the old order. The Republic declared immediately afterward was not born from triumphal conquest, but from survival under pressure. Waterloo tells a very different story. By 1815, the French Revolution no longer needed saving. Its ideas had already spread, mutated, and embedded themselves across Europe. The question at Waterloo was not whether revolutionary change would exist, but whether Napoleon Bonaparte would continue to dominate the continent. Napoleon had become the embodiment of an era, and Waterloo was the moment when that embodiment was shattered. The battle was not about preserving a movement, it was about removing a man whose ambition had exhausted Europe. Napoleon entered Waterloo with everything to lose and almost nothing to gain. Victory might have prolonged his rule, but it could not reverse the tide of resistance that had built against him. Defeat, however, would end everything. And when defeat came, it was absolute. Unlike Valmy, which preserved uncertainty and possibility, Waterloo eliminated both. Napoleon's fall closed the door on his personal vision of Europe. His exile symbolized the exhaustion of a continent that no longer believed in his leadership, regardless of the revolutionary origins that once fueled his rise. This contrast reveals something essential about how history moves. Valmy was collective. It belonged to an idea larger than any individual. No single general defined it, and no single hero emerged from it. Its importance lay in what it allowed to continue. Waterloo was intensely personal. It is remembered through Napoleon's decisions, mistakes, and final stand. Its significance lies in what it prevented from continuing. At Valmy, the revolution was fragile and needed protection. At Waterloo, Napoleon was isolated and expendable. The movement could survive without him, but he could not survive without victory. This is why Valmy feels like a rescue and Waterloo feels like an execution. One battle preserved the future of a political transformation. The other decisively cut off the future of a single ruler whose time had passed. Together, these battles show two extremes of historical impact. Valmy demonstrates how history can pivot around the survival of an idea. Waterloo demonstrates how history can pivot around the removal of an individual. One ensured that a revolution lived long enough to change the world. The other ensured that one man would never again have the power to shape it. Ask almost anyone to name a battle that changed European history, and Waterloo will come up instantly. It has everything history loves to remember: a legendary figure, a dramatic defeat, and a clear, decisive ending. Valmy, by contrast, rarely enters popular memory. It is overshadowed, glossed over, and often reduced to a footnote. Yet this imbalance in fame hides a deeper truth about how historical impact actually works. Waterloo earned its reputation because it is easy to understand. One day, one battlefield. One man's final defeat. It fits neatly into textbooks and documentaries as the moment when Napoleon fell and Europe reset itself. The imagery is powerful, the narrative simple, and the consequences immediate. Waterloo delivers closure, and closure is something history audiences instinctively recognize and remember. It gives the illusion that history moves in clear, dramatic leaps from chaos to order. Valmy offers no such simplicity. There is no towering figure whose downfall defines the event. There is no decisive destruction that screams importance. Instead, Valmy works quietly, almost invisibly, reshaping the future without demanding attention. That subtlety is precisely why it is so often overlooked. Valmy's impact unfolded over years, not hours, and history tends to favor moments that announce themselves loudly. The hidden power of Valmy lies in how it altered expectations. Before 1792, Europe believed revolutions were fragile, temporary disruptions that could be crushed by professional armies. Valmy shattered that assumption. It showed that revolutionary states could defend themselves and that ideology could mobilize societies on an unprecedented scale. This realization forced monarchies to adapt, reform, and militarize in new ways. Even when they opposed revolutionary France, they did so on terms Valmy had helped define. Waterloo, for all its fame, did not introduce a new way of thinking. It confirmed what Europe already wanted: an end to instability. The Congress of Vienna that followed was not inspired by Waterloo's innovation, but by exhaustion. Waterloo's legacy is visible and immediate, but it is also conservative. It restored balance rather than creating something new. Valmy, by contrast, destabilized the old order permanently, even though its name faded from public consciousness. This contrast reveals a paradox in historical memory. Events that start transformations often become invisible once those transformations feel inevitable. Valmy's success made the French Revolution viable, and once the revolution reshaped Europe, Valmy no longer seemed extraordinary, it became part of the background. Waterloo remained famous because it represented resistance to change, a dramatic stand against forces that had already altered the world. Even Napoleon's story depends on Valmy's obscurity. His rise was only possible because the revolution survived long enough to create opportunities for ambitious generals. Without Valmy, there is no revolutionary army to promote him, no ideological wars to fight, and no empire to build. Waterloo may end his legend, but Valmy made it possible. Yet history remembers the ending more vividly than the beginning. The fame of Waterloo and the obscurity of Valmy also reveal how storytelling shapes our understanding of the past. Waterloo gives us heroes and villains, winners and losers. Valmy gives us uncertainty, hesitation, and unintended consequences. One satisfies the desire for narrative clarity. The other challenges us to rethink what success looks like. Hidden impact is often more powerful than visible legacy. Valmy did not carve its name into memory through spectacle. It reshaped Europe by quietly changing what was possible. Waterloo stands tall in history books because it closed a chapter. Valmy remains in the shadows because it opened one, and once opened, that chapter never truly ended. History often appears to move in clean, dramatic moments, but in reality it behaves more like a chain reaction where a single, almost unremarkable event sets off consequences no one can fully predict. Valmy is one of those moments. At the time, few could have imagined that a foggy artillery exchange in 1792 would echo all the way to a muddy field in Belgium more than 20 years later. Yet, when you trace the path carefully, the line between Valmy and Waterloo becomes impossible to ignore. At Valmy, the French Revolution crossed a critical threshold. Survival transformed it from a fragile uprising into a political reality. That shift triggered a cascade of events that reshaped Europe. The revolutionary government gained confidence, and with that confidence came ambition. France moved from defending itself to exporting its ideals, not just through diplomacy but through war. Revolutionary armies marched beyond France's borders, carrying with them new concepts of citizenship, nationalism, and mass mobilization. None of this was inevitable before Valmy. The revolution could have collapsed, fractured, or been reversed. Valmy kept all paths open. From this survival emerged opportunity. The chaos and constant warfare of the revolutionary period created space for talent to rise quickly, regardless of noble birth. Napoleon Bonaparte was one of many officers shaped by this environment, but he was the one who mastered it. His ascent depended on the Revolutionary Army's existence, and that army existed because Valmy proved it could stand against Europe's monarchies. In this sense, Valmy did not just influence Napoleon's career, it made it possible. As Napoleon rose, Europe adapted. Monarchies reorganized their armies, reformed their states, and learned to fight the kind of wars the revolution had unleashed. Coalitions formed and reformed, borders shifted repeatedly. The entire continent entered a cycle of conflict that lasted more than 2 decades. Each phase of this struggle can be traced back to the moment when the revolution refused to die. Valmy was the first domino. Once it fell, the rest followed with accelerating speed. Waterloo sits at the far end of this chain reaction. By 1815, Europe was dealing not with the question of whether revolutionary change would survive, but with how to contain the damage it had already caused. Napoleon's return from exile triggered one final confrontation. Not because his ideas were new, but because the system he had built was unsustainable. Waterloo was not an isolated accident of history. It was the accumulated result of years of war, reform, resistance, and exhaustion that began when Valmy altered the balance of power. What makes this butterfly effect so striking is how disproportionate the outcomes are to the original event. Valmy did not look like the beginning of a continental upheaval. It lacked the drama, scale, and destruction usually associated with such transformations. Yet its psychological impact rippled outward, influencing decisions made by politicians, generals, and entire societies for decades. Each response created new pressures, new conflicts, and new unintended consequences. By the time Waterloo arrived, Europe was no longer reacting to Valmy directly. It was reacting to a world Valmy had helped create. Revolutionary ideas had been tested, weaponized, and institutionalized. Napoleon had risen and fallen once already. The continent had been reshaped and scarred. Waterloo was history catching up to itself, the final adjustment after a long period of imbalance. This perspective forces a reevaluation of how we assign importance to historical events. The most visible moments are often the least informative. Waterloo tells us how an era ended. Valmy explains why that era existed at all. One is the final tremor after an earthquake. The other is the fault line quietly shifting beneath the surface. The true lesson of Valmy and Waterloo is not about victory or defeat, but about causality. Small decisions, limited engagements, and moments of hesitation can generate consequences far beyond their immediate context. Valmy shows how history can pivot on survival rather than triumph. Waterloo shows how history eventually demands resolution after years of accumulated tension. Together, they reveal a pattern that repeats across time. The battles we remember are often the ones that close the story, while the battles that open it fade into obscurity, even though everything that follows depends on them. As we step back and look at Valmy and Waterloo together, a clearer picture of history begins to emerge. These were not simply two battles separated by time and geography. They were two moments performing entirely different roles in the same story. Valmy was the moment the future became possible. Waterloo was the moment that the future was forced to settle into a new shape. One allowed history to accelerate, the other demanded that it slow down. Valmy reminds us that history does not always announce its most important turning points with destruction or spectacle. Sometimes the world changes because something survives when it was expected to fail. By standing firm, the Revolutionary Army proved that ideas could defend themselves, that belief could hold a line, and that ordinary people could alter the balance of power. From that single moment of endurance flowed decades of transformation that no battlefield victory alone could have achieved. Waterloo, in contrast, shows us the cost of prolonged upheaval. It represents a world that had been reshaped and now sought stability at almost any price. Napoleon's defeat was not just the fall of a man, but the exhaustion of an era that began with revolutionary hope and ended in continental war. Waterloo closed the chapter that Valmy opened, but it could never erase the changes that had already taken root. So when we ask which battle truly shaped history, the answer depends on what we mean by shaping. If shaping means ending a story, Waterloo stands unrivaled. But if shaping means creating the conditions that define everything that follows, then Valmy quietly outweighs it. The famous defeat may have drawn the world's attention, but the forgotten stand determined the direction history would take long before the cannons of Waterloo ever fired. In the end, Valmy and Waterloo teach us that history is not driven only by dramatic finales, but by fragile beginnings that survive against the odds. The battles we remember may be the loudest, but the battles that matter most are often the ones that change what the future believes is possible.